Now, if that's not the most fitting description, then what is? Canyonlands National Park isn't really that big when you compare it to some of its desert counterparts, like Joshua Tree or Big Bend, but it's incredibly remote and inaccessible, and that is what makes this park so special. It is part of the Colorado Plateau High Desert and essentially consists of a large drainage basin with the confluence of the Green and Colorado rivers at its center. Here you can witness how those two rivers carve their way through various layers of sandstone and how they are essentially driving a continuous process of erosion on a massive scale. The result? Colorful canyons and endless badlands, topped by countless arches, pinnacles, mesas, and buttes as far as the eyes can see. This is an area that defies our comprehension with its vast distances and strange and colorful landscapes. There is no distinct feature that defines the Canyonlands. Each corner has its very own unique character. The park is situated in an extremely remote and sparsely developed corner in southeastern Utah. There is only 2 paved roads that lead in and out, and that's why most of the beautiful Canyonlands backcountry remains one of the most remote and least accessible regions of the United States to this day. There are 4 districts that make up Canyonlands National Park. The Island in the Sky and Needles districts are where you'll find most of the crowds in the developed parts. It's easy to access these parts with paved roads leading in and out, and most of the scenic spots being less than an hour from Highway 191. The other 2 districts are the Rivers and the Maze, and they make up most of the park's beautiful and remote backcountry. Those areas can only be reached via difficult trails or by boat. And that's why this is the place where you can still find a pristine wilderness that hasn't changed much over the more than 150 years since the first Europeans traveled through here. Over the last 2 years, Utah's Canyonlands have become a place where I had to return over and over again. Ever since I stood on the very edge of the Needles Overlook during my first visit back in the fall of 2022, I just couldn't get enough of it. That very first time looking at this surreal landscape, I couldn't believe my eyes. I was overwhelmed by how small and insignificant this all made me feel. I couldn't make out anything in particular, let alone fully comprehend what I was looking at. It was just incredibly beautiful, and I knew right away that one day I would explore the endless rocks and canyons of the backcountry. And eventually, on my 4th visit in the fall of 2024, I did just that. A solo backcountry adventure, exploring the White Rim Road of the Island in the Sky, the Flint Trail going into the Maze, and the Elephant Hill Road of the Needles. I plan to stay at the Gooseberry and Potato Bottom backcountry campsites along the White Rim Road, and inside the Maze district, I'd be staying at the Maze Overlook backcountry campsite. The Island in the Sky district is an area on and around a massive peninsula in between the canyons of the Colorado River to its east and the Green River to its west. The peninsula itself stretches more than 20 kilometers into the heart of Canyonlands National Park and rises above the surrounding basin. Here you have countless viewpoints overlooking the eroded landscapes up to 800 meters below the rim. Much of the plateau is well developed and easily accessible via the paved Grandview Point Road, which is why this part of the Island in the Sky is the most visited section of the entire park. The area around the Island in the Sky is a rugged plain some 500 meters below the rim, which spreads all the way to the rivers to its east, west, and south. There are numerous side canyons and basins cutting through it, which makes this part very inaccessible. This isolated land in between the plateau above and the bottom of the canyons below is the backcountry of the Island in the Sky district. The edge of this plateau drops off another 300 meters all the way to the rivers and is characterized by a white rim which can be clearly made out from the viewpoints above. To access this area, you have to hike down one of the few very long and hard trails, or you take the only road that runs along the white-colored edge of the plateau, the White Rim Road. The night before I started my journey into the backcountry, I stayed at Willow Flats Campground, which is the only developed campground inside the Island in the Sky district. It was beautifully located right next to some of the park's highlights, like the Green River Overlook. From up here, I had some of the very best sunset views in all of Utah's Canyonlands. And just a few minutes away from there was Mesa Arch, that one world-renowned, iconic sunrise viewpoint of the park. After an early morning beating the crowds to a phenomenal sunrise at Mesa Arch, I made my way to Schaefer Trail, just a short drive up the road. This spot marks the eastern entrance to the White Rim Road. The rim above Schaefer Basin was the perfect spot to enjoy some last, far-reaching views of the rugged canyons from up high. The trail looked scary, and it was one hell of a ride down there. But the road itself was in a good condition, and there were no challenging spots all the way down to the bottom of Schaefer Canyon. Once I passed the White Rim Road sign, I finally was on the actual White Rim Road and inside the Backcountry permit section. And that was where the first rocky parts and dry washes waited. It took some getting used to, but all in all, still no major challenges. The crowds from up above the rim immediately felt worlds away, and while there was still the occasional biker and fellow four-wheeler passing by, it was all quiet around me. Every mile further down the White Rim Road, away from the rush of everyday life, made me feel more and more at peace. Never mind the fact that I did not once go any faster than 8 miles per hour. I just took my time and stopped whenever possible to take in the beautiful scenery. So, the first 45 kilometers from Schaefer Canyon to my first overnight stop at Gooseberry Campground took me over 4 hours, with some longer breaks in between at Musselman Arch, the airport campground, and at one of the countless scenic spots along the White Rim, overlooking the Colorado River below. Most parts during the first day presented no difficulty at all. There were some spots that required my full attention and a very slow pace to cross. But the eastern section of the White Rim Road was mostly easy to drive. Gooseberry Campground is located near the southeastern tip of the island in the sky, with beautiful views of the La Salle Mountains in the far distance. There was a group camping at the other campsite, but because the backcountry campgrounds are so spread out, I mostly felt like I was completely alone. So, even though it was the middle of the popular fall season, and I just set up camp in one of the most popular districts of Canyonlands National Park, I was able to enjoy some true desert solitude out here. The next morning I woke up to a glorious sunrise over the La Salles and a dramatically colorful landscape around me. I prepared myself my daily breakfast for champions: scrambled eggs with bacon and baked beans, 2 bread rolls with cheese and ham, and a cup of black tea, and packed my stuff to hit the road. The next 60 kilometers to my second night in the backcountry at Potato Bottom took me around the southern tip of the island in the sky and led me into the basin of the Green River. But my first long break was after just 6 kilometers at Monument Basin. I fell in love with the incredible views right away. There were just so many spectacular viewpoints along the White Rim. It was still the early morning. I was all alone, and there was no sound coming from anywhere. The early morning sun just started to reach all the way into the canyons below. So I parked my Jeep, took out my chair, and sat down at the very edge and enjoyed the silence, along with the spectacular scenery, for 2 hours straight. On the following 20 kilometers to the Murphy Hogback campground, I passed by many other beautiful viewpoints overlooking the Green River Basin on the other side of the island in the sky. Here the road got a lot more challenging. Around 5 kilometers before Murphy Hogback, I had to go into 4 low for the very first time. That steep climb up the almost 100 meters to the top of the plateau at Murphy Hogback was the most challenging part of the White Rim Road so far. Murphy Hogback was the perfect spot for a lunch break. There were trees all over the place that offered plenty of shade, and the view up north was just breathtaking. I was able to see most of the Green River Basin, with the Green River Overlook in the far distance, and the distinct candlestick formation towards the northwest. The final 33 kilometers to Potato Bottom were mostly easy, but there were some rough and rocky parts and a couple of dry washes that had to be crossed. Some sections ran scarily close to some massive drop-offs right next to the road, which offered some exciting photo ops. I've been on the road for roughly 6 hours, including breaks and photo ops, when I reached the Potato Bottom campground. This was an idyllic spot right by the Green River, and was surrounded by trees and bushes. That's where I set up camp, right under one of the trees, the perfect spot to eat my dinner and get ready for the night. After the silence of the desert, the sounds of all the crickets and cicadas seemed like those right out of a jungle. But it also was some calming white noise that helped for a good night's sleep. The final day in the backcountry of the island in the sky. It was warm and eerily quiet once again. I prepared for my final 44 kilometers along the White Rim and Mineral Bottom roads that would lead me back to Highway 191 and back to civilization. Right after leaving Potato Bottom behind, the roughest and most difficult part of the entire White Rim Road awaited. There were some great viewpoints right along the road in between Potato Bottom and Hardscrabble Bottom, overlooking the Green River below and the Badlands in the distance. But the section leading down to Hardscrabble Bottom had some extremely steep and narrow switchbacks in it. I took it slow and scouted ahead for oncoming traffic, and eventually reached the Labyrinth Campground, the last backcountry campground along the White Rim Road inside the park. Beyond this point, the road closely followed the Green River and offered some scenic spots to overlook the lush greenery along the river. Together with the colorful canyon walls on either side of the river, this made for a beautiful scenery. Once I reached the northern park boundary, I felt elated and a sense of accomplishment. This was my longest solo backcountry adventure so far. But I also knew that there was an even bigger adventure waiting for me after I left the Mineral Canyon behind and was back on Highway 191 going up north. On my way to my next backcountry adventure west of the Green River, the Maze District of Canyonlands National Park. In the far southwest of Canyonlands National Park, cut off from the other districts by the rivers and miles of the park's inaccessible backcountry, lies the Maze. Hanksville, the nearest settlement, is a 140-kilometer drive via a rough dirt road which will take you at least 6 hours to complete. The nearest ranger station and last outpost of civilization is the remote Hans Flat Ranger Station, a 50-kilometer, 4-hour drive via the notorious Flint Trail. Because of this, the Maze District is the least visited section of the park. Depending on where you are headed, you will most likely encounter nobody else for several hours, if not days. And that is a truly unique experience, one that needs thorough planning and preparation. The maze has its very own unique character and offers incredible views and unparalleled solitude. The orange cliffs to its west separate it from the outside world, and to its east, the Colorado River separates the maze from the backcountry of the Needles District. In between is a surreal landscape of colorful mesas and buttes that rise from a large network of narrow and intertwined canyons. Staying overnight in this remote country is a once-in-a-lifetime experience and a true wilderness adventure. After my White Rim Road adventure, I stayed in Hanksville for a night. The next morning I stocked up on food, water, and gas at the local Hollow Mountain convenience store, and also filled up an extra 5-gallon canister, just to be on the safe side for the 300-kilometer out-and-back drive into one of the most remote and inaccessible sections of Canyonlands National Park. The trip to the Maze Overlook was a roughly 150-kilometer drive with 72 kilometers of unpaved roads and an additional 45 kilometers of rough trails only suitable for high-clearance 4-wheel drive vehicles. I planned for roughly 7 hours to get to the Maze Overlook campground and started in the morning in order to be able to get there before sunset. My first planned stop along the way would be the Hans Flat Ranger Station, which is a 72-kilometer and 2-hour drive via an unpaved road from Highway 24. This first section was mostly uneventful and the roads were in good condition. Most of it led through open range farmland and a seemingly endless prairie-like landscape. The only notable feature along the way was a vast, colorful dune field about halfway to the ranger station. This was my first unplanned stop, where I kicked off my shoes and went for a short walk. The Hans Flat Ranger Station was the last opportunity to use a pit toilet and stock up on basics. I just went inside to let the ranger know my travel route and when I'd be back. Since I already got my backcountry permit at the Backcountry office in Moab, I was good to go. From here on out, the road conditions changed immediately, with the first rough patches starting right after the ranger station. But most of the next 20 kilometers was still in a comparatively good condition and relatively easy to drive. I just had to take it slow. Good thing I left Hanksville early. There were some beautiful scenic overlooks along the rim of the Canyonlands basin located right next to the road, with sweeping views all the way to the La Salle Mountains, roughly 80 kilometers out east. After another 2 hours, I arrived at Flint Cove, the beginning of the notorious Flint Trail. And once again, I was all alone in this beautiful desert country. In front of me was nothing but wilderness and rugged valleys that stretched out forever. I was excited and nervous at the same time. I've read so much about the Flint Trail during the past months, and much of it was just highlighting how rough and difficult this passage was, and how careful you have to be to go down this trail. From the top of the Flint Trail Overlook, I was able to scout ahead and see if there was anyone making their way up the narrow switchbacks for the next 5 kilometers. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I finally decided to get going. And it was rough. It was quite challenging to get down there, but I was well prepared, and by now also knew my way around the Wrangler. But then again, navigating down the orange cliffs sometimes required 3-point turns in order to steer around the narrow curves. With oncoming traffic, the whole situation would have been extremely difficult to manage, but after a couple of large rocks, sharp edges and tight curves, I was back down in the Canyonlands basin, several hundred meters below the rim of the orange cliffs, which separated this isolated place from the outside world. Once again, I was elated, but I soon had to find out that that was a bit premature. I believed that the hard part was over. I had been on the road for roughly 5 hours already and was fully motivated to take on the final 20 kilometers to the Maze Overlook. Much of the drive through the Laterite Basin was incredibly scenic. There were those steep canyon walls rising on either side and numerous buttes all around the landscape. I stopped as often as I could to take in this beautiful scenery and experience that pure solitude with no one else around. But as I got close to completing my 6th hour behind the wheel, I realized that the road had gotten progressively worse. And by the time I reached the Maze Overlook Road, around 8 kilometers from the Maze Overlook campground, I started to fear the worst for the final stretch ahead. And well, I was right. Those final 8 kilometers and 1-hour drive along the Maze Overlook Road had been the most exhausting and challenging of my entire week in the Canyonlands backcountry. About halfway into the road, once I had reached the Western National Park boundary, I even briefly considered giving up altogether. That's when it hit me that I was all by myself and that I had been on the road for almost 7 hours by that time. But I decided to keep going and cautiously worked my way forward meter by meter. I stepped out of the Wrangler every 100 meters or so to scout ahead on foot for any major obstacles on the road. And then finally, there it was. After more than 7 hours and 150 kilometers on some of the roughest roads that I have been on to this day, I arrived at the Maze Overlook, all by myself. And it was absolutely worth it, a place unlike anything else on this planet. This isn't some rugged canyon similar to the Grand Canyon, or rock formations that look like those in the Monument Valley. For me, it was the combination of it all that made this place so uniquely beautiful. The views from the Maze Overlook were spectacular in any direction, with the twisted, narrow, slot-like canyons of the maze below stretching out towards the east and south, all the way to the horizon. Towards the north and west, I could see the towering walls of the orange cliffs, as well as the island in the sky, glowing dramatically in the far distance. Beyond, there were the blue and La Salle Mountains, with massive storm clouds towering above them. And in between were countless mesas and rock spires rising from the desert landscape. I knew there was nobody else in that area, and the last person I saw was the ranger at Hans Flat, roughly 4 hours and 45 kilometers ago. I was isolated in one of the most remote places of the United States, separated from the rest of the world by miles of pristine wilderness, rugged canyons, cliffs, mesas, and endless plains. I just sat there, watching the landscape change its colors in the light of the setting sun. The storm clouds raced by in the far distance with the occasional rainbow appearing below them. And once the sun went down, the moon rose above the distant storm clouds, which were illuminated by countless lightning flashes. All of this was happening right in front of me, yet everything was so peaceful and quiet. An experience so calming yet exhilarating that I hardly got any sleep that night. I got up many times to just watch the distant thunderstorms while being surrounded by this absolute silence. Words just don't do it any justice. You'll have to see it for yourselves. The next morning, I was up very early, just before sunrise. I was still alone and kept wondering about my way back. Those steep drops, dry sandy washes, and sharp rocks. But I had enough time, and by now, I knew what to expect. Both excited and eager to go, but also not quite ready to leave this mysterious world behind. I started my way back to civilization. That drive would be the longest of my entire trip, roughly 9 hours to cover almost 400 kilometers in order to get from the Maze Overlook to the Needles campground, 2 points that are less than 20 kilometers apart as the crow flies. The first 8 kilometers along the Maze Overlook road were still quite daunting and nerve-wracking, but I felt like the drive wasn't nearly as tiring as the day before. I made good time traversing the Laterite Basin, which allowed for some breaks along the way. I did not feel quite ready yet to rush back to civilization. But there was one last challenge waiting at the far end of the basin: the climb up the canyon wall along the Flint Trail. I put my Wrangler into 4 low, scouted ahead for any oncoming traffic, and crept my way up the narrow switchbacks, stopping every now and then to step out and check which way to take across the large rocks and holes in the middle of the road. And then, 2.5 hours from the Maze Overlook, I found myself back on top of the cliffs in an entirely different world. One last look back towards Terra Incognita, and off I went towards Hans Flat. And right here, just before the ranger station, I encountered oncoming traffic for the very first time in nearly 20 hours, back in the rush of civilization. The Needles district, in the far southwest of Canyonlands National Park, is characterized by vast open grasslands, mixed with colorful pinnacles and narrow canyons. It is quite isolated, deep inside the Canyonlands basin, but it can be easily reached via a paved road, which means that the Needles district can be quite busy at times. This also applies to some parts of the Needles backcountry, which are easier reachable than most of the backcountry of the Island in the Sky or the Maze. The 4-wheel drive tracks are some of the park's most difficult, but there is a dense network of easily accessible hiking trails that offer good opportunities for full and multi-day hikes. The Needles campground is the district's only developed campground and makes for a great base camp to explore the Needles' main attractions. The Big Spring Overlook and Elephant Hill trailheads both lead deep into the Needles backcountry and are just minutes from the campground. After a long drive from the Maze to the Needles district and a beautiful night by the campfire inside the Needles campground, I was looking forward to some time off the road and on the hiking trails of the Needles backcountry. My first hike started from the Big Spring Canyon trailhead and went all the way to the Confluence Overlook, where the Green and Colorado rivers meet. This is the heart of Canyonlands National Park, where the Island in the Sky, the Needles, and the Maze districts meet. Right after the trailhead, the trail winds through the Big Spring Canyon up and down some very steep and rocky sections. But after the first 900 meters, I was hiking mostly on flat terrain with a few climbing sections and a lot of beautiful viewpoints along the 8-kilometer trail. Towards the end, I had to continue along Devil's Lane for the final 1.5 kilometers, a track that had to be shared with 4-wheel drive vehicles. There was some traffic, but it was no problem at all for neither of us to share the road. Lucky for me, all the Jeeps and Toyotas left just before I arrived at the parking lot, and once I climbed up the final 500 meters to the Overlook, I noticed that I was, once again, all by myself. Only at the bottom of the canyon, some 300 meters below on the river, I saw a single kayak crossing the confluence. It was a beautiful sight, with the 2 different colors of both rivers continuing side by side for some miles before they eventually mixed. It was a rewarding but relatively easy hike, and it took me roughly 3 hours to complete the 16 kilometers out and back. My next stop was the Elephant Hill trailhead, from where I was planning to explore the Elephant Hill and Devil's Kitchen area. I decided to hike the roughly 6 kilometers one way along the 4-wheel drive road over the Elephant Hill into the Devil's Kitchen. These roads are among the most difficult of Canyonlands National Park, and so there was not too much traffic during my hike. In fact, there was just one vehicle passing me during the entire 3-hour hike, so I was able to enjoy the beauty of the Elephant Hill, the Devil's Canyon, the Devil's Pocket, and also the Devil's Kitchen mostly by myself. The first 2 kilometers were quite steep and narrow, and I was glad I only had to hike these sections and not drive them all by myself. Leaving the Elephant Hill behind, I continued through Devil's Canyon, past colorful sandstone cliffs and spires, all the way to Devil's Pocket, from where I finally got a first glimpse of the iconic Needles rock spires in between Devil's Kitchen and Chesler Park. Once I arrived at the Devil's Kitchen campground, I found a way up some nearby rocks from where I could enjoy the scenery. There were some people in the area, but it was nowhere near as busy as the developed Needles campground or at any of the sites along the paved park road. While the Needles backcountry felt more busy than the backcountry of the Island in the Sky or the Maze, it was still such a rewarding experience to be out here with most of the crowds preferring to stay on the paved roads. Out here, I enjoyed some of these very last moments in the Canyonlands backcountry. Before it got dark, I started the 1.5-hour hike back, watching one last dramatically colorful desert sunset over Canyonlands from atop Elephant Hill. Filled to the brim with lasting memories, I drove back to the Needles campground. After a week out in the desert mostly by myself, I did not know if I was quite ready yet to leave all of this behind.